Melissa, and with help of my team members, Corey, Ryan, Edwin, Christina, Gianna, and Chinny, we're going to teach you more about affirmative action. I say more because our awesome professor already went over some of this, but we're just going to elaborate on it a little more.
That's my favorite slide.
So what is affirmative action? Affirmative action is a policy that favors those who tend to suffer from discrimination. The purpose is to create better opportunities for minorities and disadvantaged persons in the employment and education places. We're going to start off with the history of affirmative action, as you can see by this timeline that I made. Affirmative action began in 1961 and has changed and grew over the last 50 years. So on March 6, 1961 was the beginning of affirmative action. President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order that essentially created the EEOC, which stands for Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and you'll learn more about that later. This was a mandatory law that said that employment places were not allowed to be racially biased. And on July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which described that the same thing, which banned discrimination in the workplace and public places. And as you can see by the picture, that's Lyndon Johnson shaking Martin Luther King's hand after giving him a pen that was used to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the quote says, "It cannot continue. Our Constitution, the foundation, and our Republic forbids it, mortally forbids it, and the law I will sign tonight forbids it." And then on June 4th, 1965, President Lyndon visited Howard University and gave a speech at their graduation ceremony, and he elaborated more on affirmative action by saying that it's more than just a civil law. It helps push the civil laws. This is him. This is a picture of him, and he's just, to summarize this quote, he's saying that the civil laws are not enough to remedy discrimination over the years. We need to level out the playing field. And this is the first court case, the first landmark Supreme Court case about the University of California, which had too strict of a quota. 16 out of its 100 places were for minorities and disadvantaged youth. But Alan Bake was a white student that was rejected twice, even though minority students that had significantly lower grades than him got in. And the court ruled that even though race can be a factor in admission, the strict quotas were not admissible. And this is another case that was against the enforcement of a spending bill that required that 15% of the public work funds go to qualified minority contractors. And this was ruled okay by the court because it didn't affect non-minorities. This was a case against the Board of Education that laid off non-minorities in order to protect minorities, and the case ruled against this because the loss of the non-minorities did not justify the benefit of the minority. And this was the Ardenand Constructors Incorporated versus Pena case was a case that brought up strict scrutiny, which is the most stringent level of review, which requires that racial classifications. This is the same case, and this is a quote from one of the judges, that the unhappy persistence of both the practice and the lingering effects of racial discrimination against minority groups in this country justified the remedial affirmative action programs. And this is a quote from President Clinton in July 1995. He said that our demand caused stricter standards to mandate reform of affirmative action. It actually reaffirmed the need for affirmative action programs and reaffirmed the continuing existence of systematic discrimination in the United States. And after that, Clinton called for the elimination of any program that created a quota, that created preferences for those who are unqualified, that created reverse discrimination, and that any program that continued to use equal opportunity, that even though it's already been proposed. So that's all the history that I could fit in the 6 minutes that I was standing up here. And I'm going to talk about my job, which is at a company called Mom's Meat, and they market for products that are healthy, like healthy food, healthy cleaning products, healthy vitamins for kids. Feel free to tell your parents to sign up. You get free stuff in exchange for a feedback survey. And this is part of the company. This is when our website launched. And as you can see, there's various men and women, different ages, different ethnicities and races. And I believe that because they're so different, they bring different ideas and ways of thinking to the table. And so that they are an example of how diversity works. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking with me for that 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And now Corey is going to talk more about affirmative action laws.
Hey guys, how's it going? I'm going to be talking about some of the affirmative action laws. So affirmative action laws were basically implemented to completely get rid of segregation and discrimination in the workforce. I think it's important to note that that's not just for the workplace, but also educational institutions. So the laws today, they've evolved over the past couple of decades through governmental acts, court decrees, and volunteer programs. And the volunteer programs are usually instigated by the private sector, and I think that's pretty significant because most of these have to do with the public sector. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it prohibited discrimination in firms, and it really kick-started the affirmative action kind of movement and going in that direction. It was also the beginning of the laws that protected individual rights. So the revised Philadelphia plan. It was a plan, it was kind of an experiment. They chose Philadelphia to use it on. It was in an attempt to integrate and just basically overall diversify the workforce in Philadelphia. Executive orders, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of executive orders. Executive orders are issued directly from the president. He meets in a room with his constituents and he writes, and he basically signs it. It's really important to note that it has the full backing of the law and the Constitution. It's coming straight from the president. First, there were many executive orders. Executive Order 8802. It was issued in order to prohibit racial discrimination in the national defense industry. This was in 1941. So we're going to war soon. It was an effort for Truman to really just rally the country and get rid of groups. This is Executive Order 9980, one of our many lovely executive orders I'll be mentioning. It instituted fair employment practices within civilian agencies. That's significant because civilian agencies are now, if you do any work with the government, if you get any funding from them, you have to have an affirmative action program. Executive Order 9981, it named the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services. It really just complements and supplements the earlier point and the last side and the Executive Order 9980. Executive Order 10925, it requires government contractors to consider affirmative action steps and also establish the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. The President's Committee basically enforces all the laws that come from this executive order. The next executive order, Executive Order 1114, it supplements the previous one. So it forces all federal funds to comply with affirmative action. As I mentioned before, if you do any work with the government, you have to have an affirmative action program. That's contractors, subcontractors, civilian agencies, it does not matter. So Executive Order 11625, it builds upon the Office of Minority Business Enterprises, which basically they give money and give funds to businesses owned by minorities. And it also issues that, it also says that the Secretary of Commerce has the authority to implement federal laws against it. Executive Order 12138, it created the National Women's Business Enterprise Policy. It's very similar to the women's enterprise, to the minority enterprise, as it gives funding and money to companies owned by women. God bless. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically Section 501 and also 504, which touches on disabilities, but I'll be getting to that soon. It requires federal agencies to implement affirmative employment opportunity programs. I think it's a good example of how all the affirmative action laws overlap. Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 prohibits unjustified discrimination based on disability. So it doesn't matter whether you have a mental or physical disability, you cannot get turned away from an application if you have just a disability in general. It really doesn't matter how specific it is. So affirmative action plans, my good friend Edwin, or actually Ryan, will be touching on that soon. Basically, most government programs, agencies, contractors, they're required to use affirmative action programs. And it's, like I said before, you need one of these programs if you're going to be involved with the government. So it's very smart to adopt the program before you do work with the government. I think a good example of adopting these rules before any work with the government or at all is the Rooney Rule in the NFL, which mentions that you have to, each NFL team has to interview at least one minority head coach or for a senior football operations management job. And some states actually ban affirmative action. I know, but it's only, it's really just specific towards public institutions. So basically, people disagree with using affirmative action within colleges because it almost turns into some colleges' main tool, like for attracting students. So they only care about diversity. So my new and you, I worked at ShopRite 3 years ago. It was a very progressive environment, surprisingly. It was a Perlmutter ShopRite in Jackson. Very diverse workforce, and they offered a lot of programs for students and minorities alike. So I actually had a friend, I don't know if anybody knows him, his name's Tommy Clark. He's from my hometown. He actually went to Rowan and graduated, and he, last summer, he actually applied for the minority training program, got in, and they offer him mentoring, they offer him free training, all that, and he's actually assistant manager right now. So up next is going to be training within affirmative action with my good friend Ryan Zuss.
Is that on pause?
Yes.
Okay, good job. Let me ask the class, do you know why the president passed all of these orders instead of going through the normal process, which would be to send the bill to the Hill, Congress?
What do you got voted down?
Yep. It was the right thing to do during Kennedy's time and Lyndon Johnson and the other times, but that's why they're all executive orders, because it made you feel good.
What's the difference between pacing and pacing an order? Not, and I hope that's not a stupid question.
An executive order would come straight from the president, basically. An order, you kind of have to go through Congress and
And they can't say anything because it's an order.
That's right. The president can say, you will do this. You can make an executive order. Trump's made like...
But it's a positive thing.
Yeah, when it's
Good.
moral and if
Yeah,
it's the right
absolutely.
thing to do, Congress is behind the times, that's when they should be ordered, not when you just want to do something outside of Congress, which
Right.
is kind of what's going on here and now in our world, but I won't get into that. All right, well done. Sorry for the interruption, but
No worries.
no, I'm not sorry.
So, what I wanted to start out with was an interesting quote, and this really helped me understand affirmative action. And what it's saying is, it compares it to the NFL draft, and the NFL draft gives their first pick to the worst team. And they don't do this out of compassion or sympathy. They just do it because they know that their league is only as strong as their weakest team. So, in order to have a successful league, you need to have good NFL teams to be competitive. Now, this was is affirmative action a good thing? Many people disagree and agree on that. There's been many Supreme Court cases, the one like I'm going to talk about later, about people saying they didn't get in because of their skin